After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, new states started popping up all over Western Europe and North Africa. These states, mostly set up by Germanic peoples, became the main governments during the early Middle Ages. Creating these kingdoms wasn't straightforward or planned. It all began when the Roman Empire couldn't manage the influx of barbarian migrants at its borders. This mismanagement led to invasions and, surprisingly, invitations into Roman territories. Despite welcoming these groups, the Romans never fully integrated them into their system. Initially, barbarian leaders were just local warlords or client kings without any real territorial power. Their influence grew as Roman emperors and usurpers used them in their power struggles. These barbarian territories only turned into proper kingdoms after the Roman central authority fell apart. To establish their legitimacy, barbarian kings often tied themselves to the Roman Empire. They adopted the title Dominus Noster, which means our Lord, previously used by Roman emperors, and many took on the name Flavius, a common name among late Roman emperors. Most of these rulers also positioned themselves as subordinates in their dealings with the Eastern Roman Empire. Although many aspects of the Roman administration continued under barbarian rule, the old system gradually faded away, especially during times of political chaos. Most of these kingdoms were fragile and didn't last long. By the time Charlemagne was crowned emperor in 800, only his Frankish kingdom remained from the once vast network of barbarian kingdoms. Now, let's talk about the term barbarian kingdoms. Modern historians use this term to describe the kingdoms that emerged in Western Europe after the Western Roman Empire's collapse. However, some scholars criticize this term because barbarian has a negative connotation. They also point out that many of these kingdoms were supported by former Roman elites. Alternative names like post-Roman kingdoms, Roman barbarian kingdoms, and early medieval kingdoms have been suggested. Interestingly, the term barbarian kingdom wasn't used by the people living in those kingdoms to describe their own states. Early medieval writers might have called other kingdoms barbarian, but never their own. And the rise of barbarian kingdoms in the territories once governed by the Western Roman Empire was a gradual, complex, and largely unintentional process. This origin can be traced back to the migrations of large numbers of non-Roman peoples into Roman lands. Although the migration period is often called the barbarian invasions, these movements were driven by both invasions and invitations. Inviting people from beyond the imperial frontier to settle Roman territory was not new and had been done several times by past emperors for economic, agricultural, or military purposes. Given the vastness and power of the Roman Empire, it had an almost infinite capacity for immigration. And in 376, the Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube River and settle in the Balkans by the Eastern Roman Empire. Numbering around 50,000 people, including 10,000 warriors, the Visigoths were refugees fleeing the Ostrogoths, who were themselves fleeing the Huns. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, welcomed the Visigoths, seeing an opportunity to recruit their warriors at a low cost to bolster his armies. Typically, barbarian tribes seeking to settle in the empire were broken into smaller groups and resettled across imperial territory. However, the Visigoths were allowed to remain united and chose Thrace as their place of settlement. Despite the Roman state's promise to provide food, the imperial logistics system could not handle the large number of refugees. Roman officials, under the command of Lupicinus, worsened the crisis by selling much of the food before it reached the Visigoths. Starvation forced some Visigoth families to sell their children into Roman slavery for food. The situation escalated into a full-scale rebellion after Lupicinus had a group of high-ranking Visigoths killed, leading to the Gothic War. In 378, the Visigoths inflicted a crippling defeat on the Eastern Roman field army at the Battle of Adrianople, where Emperor Valens was also killed. The defeat at Adrianople shocked the Romans and forced them to negotiate with and settle the Visigoths within the imperial borders. The treaties at the conclusion of the Gothic War made the Visigoths semi-independent foederati under their own leaders, able to be called upon and drafted into the Roman army. Unlike previous settlements, the Visigoths were not dispersed but given cohesive lands in the provinces of Scythia, Moesia, and perhaps Macedonia. Although Adrianople was disastrous, several modern historians argue that it was not a decisive step in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Other than remaining a cohesive group, the Visigoth settlement was not much different from previous ones, and they had been effectively pacified and contained by the early 380s. Roman civil wars in the late 4th century and periods of Cold War between the Western and Eastern Roman empires allowed the Visigoths, under their leader Alaric I, to become a significant force in imperial politics, only loosely linked to the imperial government. Both Visigoths and Romans knew that Gothic autonomy had been accepted because there were few alternatives. Repeated Gothic casualties in Roman wars likely made the Visigoths increasingly suspicious of Roman intentions. In this context, the Visigoths revolted several times under Alaric, who sought a formal position within the imperial framework as a Roman general and payment for his followers as Roman soldiers. Alaric was repeatedly caught in the rivalry and court intrigue between the Eastern and Western empires. His failure to obtain formal recognition eventually led to his forces sacking Rome in 410, and the late 4th century saw Roman civil wars wreak havoc on the Western Roman Empire's defenses. In 388, Eastern Emperor Theodosius I defeated the Western usurper Magnus Maximus, and in 384, he again triumphed over another Western rival, Eugenius. These conflicts resulted in significant losses for the Western Roman army. After Magnus Maximus, no Western emperor ventured north of Lyon, leading to a significant decline in imperial presence in Britannia and northern Gaul. Local authorities were withdrawn to southern Gaul, aristocrats fled south, and the regional capital moved from Trier to Arles. Archaeological evidence shows a rapid collapse of Roman industries and civilization in these regions, effectively shifting the border of imperial control from the Rhine to the Loire. Between 405 and 407, large numbers of barbarians, including the Alans, Vandals, and Suebi, crossed into Gaul. These groups, heavily reliant on Roman gifts, were prompted to migrate west as these gifts ceased and the Huns advanced from the east. They quickly overran the remaining Roman defenses, leading to the Roman forces in Britain proclaiming Constantine III as emperor in 407. Constantine III managed to keep the barbarians somewhat in check along the Rhine. However, his reign ended due to further internal Roman conflicts, leaving the armies in Gaul in disarray and allowing barbarian tribes to penetrate deep into Gaul and Hispania. With military and administrative collapse, the imperial government effectively abandoned Britannia and northern Gaul around 410. In Britannia, this led to the fragmentation into numerous local kingdoms, while in northern Gaul, groups like the Franks and Burgundians took control. And the second stage in the formation of the barbarian kingdoms involved the Roman Empire's reluctant acceptance of the new reality. By the 420s and 430s, the Roman government began to tolerate semi-autonomous barbarian territories. Neither the Romans nor the various barbarian groups initially aimed to establish new and lasting kingdoms. The rise of these kingdoms resulted from Roman administrative failures and the inability to integrate barbarian leaders into the Roman system. Early barbarian rulers were tolerated only on Roman terms, and early kingdoms, such as those of the Suebi and Vandals in Hispania, were confined to less important provinces. In 418, Emperor Honorius settled the Visigoths, previously led by Alaric, in Aquitania in southern Gaul, establishing the Visigothic kingdom. The Romans saw this as a provisional settlement of loyal clients rather than a cession of territory. Roman administration was envisioned to continue in these lands, overseen by the Visigoths as vassals. However, the civil wars following Honorius's death shifted focus away from suppressing barbarian rulers, making them useful internal players instead. The third stage was the imperial government's recognition of its inability to administer its territories effectively. This led to ceding control to barbarian rulers, whose realms became permanent fixtures in the landscape. Treaties with the Visigoths in 439 and the Vandals in 442 recognized these rulers as territorial governors, ending the pretense of active imperial administration. These treaties laid the foundations for true territorial kingdoms. Barbarian rulers took various steps to legitimize themselves within the Roman framework, nominally subservient to the Western Roman Emperor. This practice continued even after the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476. Post-476, barbarian rulers often presented themselves as subservient to the Eastern Roman Emperor and were sometimes granted honors by the imperial government. By the late 5th century, barbarian rulers in Western Europe had largely stopped waiting for the Western Roman Empire to resume its former functions. Gradually, these rulers began assuming the roles once held by Roman emperors, evolving into proper territorial kings. This shift was facilitated by the support of local Roman aristocrats, who increasingly saw the restoration of central Roman control as a lost cause. Many aristocrats even raised armies from their own lands to support or oppose these new rulers. Despite these changes, the people living in barbarian-controlled territories continued to see themselves as part of the Roman Empire well into the 6th century. When Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, also became the ruler of the Visigoths in Hispania in 511, this was celebrated in Ravenna as a reunification of Visigothic territories with the Roman Empire, despite these territories being nominally part of the empire already. The transformation of barbarian leaders into kings was a gradual and complex process. Alaric I is often retroactively called the first king of the Visigoths, though contemporary sources referred to him as dux or hegemon. Alaric spent his career trying, unsuccessfully, to integrate his people into the Roman system. It wasn't until Alaric II that a Visigothic ruler called himself a king and began issuing documents from something like an imperial chancery. By the 450s, there was widespread recognition of a Visigothic kingdom in Gaul, but it wasn't until the reign of Liudvigild in the 560s, after significant conquests in Hispania, that the Visigoths established a secure post-imperial kingdom. The relationship between the barbarian kingdoms and the Eastern Roman Emperor ended with Emperor Justinian I's wars of reconquest. Justinian aimed to restore direct imperial control over the former Western Empire, but his efforts were incomplete. His reconquest efforts led to the idea that any lands outside the direct control of the Eastern Empire were no longer part of the Roman Empire, causing Roman identity to decline in Western Europe. Despite this, Visigothic coinage continued to depict Eastern emperors until the 580s, when Visigothic kings began minting coins in their own names. And the rise of the barbarian kingdoms dispersed power across Western Europe, moving from centralized capitals like Rome and Ravenna to several local kings and warlords. Despite this fragmentation, the structures of the former imperial government continued to function because barbarian rulers adopted many aspects of Roman administration. Roman law remained the predominant legal system through the 5th and 6th centuries, and several barbarian kings even issued their own law codes based on Roman law. Towns and cities, the backbone of the old Roman Empire, initially retained their importance in the barbarian kingdoms. The transition away from the Roman imperial framework was a gradual process, occasionally accelerated by political upheaval. Some remnants of the old Roman administrative system, such as provinces, dioceses, and praetorian prefectures, continued to function under barbarian rule. For instance, in 510, Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, restored the praetorian prefecture of Gaul and appointed the Roman aristocrat Liberius as its prefect. Many Roman political and bureaucratic offices survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as evidenced by various law codes issued by barbarian kings. Numerous documents show that Romans continued to hold significant offices within these kingdoms. According to historian Peter Brown, the establishment of barbarian kingdoms did not end Roman society, but rather brought law and order to regions that had long suffered from a lack of authority. The main difference between the Roman imperial administration and the new royal administrations was their scale. Without a central imperial court to link the governments of different provinces, the administrations in the barbarian kingdoms became less complex. The smaller size of these kingdoms meant that official power was more limited, and opportunities for personal advancement in careers that had existed in the old empire were no longer available. This breakdown in Roman order led to a decline in living standards and a collapse in economic and social complexity, though some regions, like Gaul, experienced economic upswings in the 6th century. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, barbarian rulers in Western Europe sought to strengthen their legitimacy by adopting elements of the former empire. The title most widely used by these kings was Rex, which they used in diplomacy with other kingdoms and the surviving imperial court in Constantinople. Although some Eastern Roman authors, like Procopius, described Rex as a barbarian term, it had occasionally been used to describe Roman emperors and signified that the barbarian rulers were sovereign, though not superior to the emperor in Constantinople. Many barbarian kings used ethnic qualifiers in their titles, such as the Frankish kings who called themselves Rex Francorum, King of the Franks. The rulers of Italy, where the pretense of Roman continuity was especially strong, rarely used ethnic qualifiers. In addition to Rex, barbarian rulers adopted various Roman imperial titles and honors. Nearly all barbarian kings assumed the style Dominus Noster, our Lord, a title previously used only by Roman emperors. Many Visigothic kings and the barbarian kings of Italy also used the praenomen Flavius, which was borne by virtually all Roman emperors in late antiquity. Early barbarian rulers maintained a subordinate position to the emperors in Constantinople and were sometimes recognized with various honors by these emperors, effectively serving as highly autonomous client kings. Despite being ruled by non-Romans, no one in late antiquity doubted that these kingdoms belonged to the greater late Roman political system. Although rooted in barbarian traditions, the kingdoms were linked to high Roman imperial magistracies, and their rulers held formal and recognized vice-imperial powers. And in the early 6th century, Theodoric the Great of Italy and Clovis of the Franks were the most powerful kings in Western Europe. Both received honors and recognition from the imperial court in Constantinople, granting them a degree of legitimacy and justifying their territorial expansions. Emperor Anastasius I recognized Theodoric as a patrician and returned the Western imperial regalia, held in Constantinople since 476, to Italy. Theodoric wore these regalia on certain occasions, and some Roman subjects even referred to him as an emperor, though he carefully used the title Rex to avoid offending the emperor. After the Franks defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Vauil in 507, Clovis was recognized by Anastasius as an honorary consul, a patrician, and a client king. Like Theodoric, some of Clovis's subjects referred to him as an emperor, though he never adopted that title. Theodoric and Clovis came close to war several times, and it is conceivable that the victor of such a conflict might have re-established the Western Roman Empire under his rule. Although no war occurred, these developments worried the Eastern Roman emperors. Concerned that their honors might be seen as imperial endorsements, the Eastern court became more cautious and never granted such recognition to the same extent again. Instead, the Eastern Empire began to emphasize its own exclusive Roman legitimacy, a stance it would maintain throughout its history. In the 6th century, Eastern Roman historians started to describe the West as lost to barbarian invasions, overlooking that many barbarian kings had been settled by the Romans themselves. This development, termed the Justinianic ideological offensive by modern historians, helped shape the narrative. Though the rise of barbarian kingdoms replaced the Western Empire, the idea of sudden and violent barbarian invasions ending antiquity is misleading. The Vandal kingdom in Africa was the only realm largely created through military conquest. Blaming the fall of the Western Roman Empire solely on barbarian invasions oversimplifies the period and ignores the empire's role in its own collapse. And despite the division into smaller realms, the people of the barbarian kingdoms maintained strong cultural and religious connections with each other and continued to speak Latin. The barbarian kings adopted Christianity, firmly established as the Roman religion, and the Latin language, inheriting and preserving Rome's cultural heritage. At the same time, they retained their non-Roman identity and made efforts to establish their distinct identities. Roman identity gradually disappeared in Western Europe due to the Eastern Roman Empire emphasizing its unique Roman legitimacy and the merging of the local barbarian ruling class with the Roman population. The fading connection to the Roman Empire and the political fragmentation of the West led to the gradual fragmentation of culture and language, eventually giving rise to the modern Romance peoples and Romance languages. The barbarian kingdoms proved to be extremely fragile. Among the three most powerful and enduring, those of the Visigoths, Franks, and Lombards, only the Frankish Kingdom survived into the early Middle Ages. The Visigothic kingdom faced significant challenges in the 6th century and required restoration by Leovigild in the 560s and 570s. However, it ultimately fell when conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate in the early 8th century. Similarly, the Eastern Emperor Justinian I, during his wars of reconquest, destroyed both the Vandal kingdom in Africa and the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. Most smaller kingdoms in Gaul were either absorbed into the Frankish kingdom or faded from historical records entirely. The emergence of barbarian kingdoms was largely a Roman political phenomenon that developed within the late Roman geopolitical context. As these kingdoms fell, new realms emerged in the 7th through 9th centuries, representing a new order that was largely disconnected from the old Roman world. The Umayyad Caliphate, which conquered Hispania from the Visigoths and North Africa from the Eastern Roman Empire, made no pretensions of Roman continuity. The Lombard kingdom, although often considered one of the barbarian kingdoms, ruled in Italy devastated by conflicts between the Ostrogoths and the Eastern Roman Empire. Their rule ended when the Franks conquered their kingdom in 704. The small successor kingdoms of the Visigoths in Hispania, predecessors to medieval realms like Leon, Castile, and Aragon, were culturally and administratively closer to the Frankish kingdom than to the fallen Visigothic kingdom. As the sole survivor of the old kingdoms, the Frankish kingdom became the model of early medieval kingship that would inspire Western European monarchs throughout the Middle Ages. Although Frankish rulers remembered Roman ideals and often aspired to vague notions of imperial restoration, their centuries of rule transformed their governance into something that bore little resemblance to the Roman Empire. Their government was personal, based on the powers and relationships of individuals rather than the heavily administrated, judicial, and bureaucratic system of the Romans. The era of the barbarian kingdoms came to a definitive end with the coronation of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as Roman emperor by Pope Leo III in 800. This act was in direct opposition to the authority of the remaining Eastern Roman Empire. Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire, a precursor to modern France and Germany, was more akin to a collection of kingdoms united solely by Charlemagne's authority than to a realm with a meaningful connection to the old Western Roman Empire.